She was ready to give up completely, until the invisible worked a miracle that left her in tears. I sat on the edge of my worn-out couch, staring blankly at the cluttered coffee table in front of me. The table was covered with unopened envelopes, most of them stamped with glaring red letters. Past due. My fingers absently traced a deep crack running through the wood, a scar that had been there for years. It was like everything else in my life, damaged but barely holding together. The apartment was dim, lit only by the cold, bluish glow of a street lamp outside my window. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound breaking the oppressive silence. I didn't bother turning on the lights. It felt pointless. What was the use of electricity if I'd lose the apartment by the end of the week? My heart was heavy, a deep ache that pressed against my ribs and made it hard to breathe. I'd been trying, really trying, to keep things together, but the universe seemed determined to push me further into a pit I couldn't climb out of. My part-time job at the diner barely paid enough to cover food, let alone rent and utilities. Friends and family had stopped calling weeks ago, likely tired of my constant struggles. I didn't blame them. I was tired of myself too. The final blow had come that morning when my manager told me they'd cut my hours. Business was slow, she said, her voice kind but firm. Just hang in there, she added, but I could tell she didn't really expect me to. The words were hollow, a platitude I'd heard too many times before. I leaned back, staring at the ceiling as tears welled up in my eyes. I hated crying. It felt like admitting defeat. But tonight, there was no one to put on a brave face for. No one to reassure, no one to pretend for. I let the tears fall, hot and silent, rolling down my cheeks and dripping onto the threadbare sweater I wore. It was a dangerous place to be, this dark, suffocating emptiness where hope seemed like a cruel joke. The thought crossed my mind that maybe it would be easier to just let go, to stop fighting a battle I was clearly losing. But even that idea felt too exhausting to entertain fully. I stared out the rain-streaked window. The city was alive with lights and noise, but it all felt so far away, like a world I no longer belonged to. I thought about the people walking down the streets, huddled under umbrellas or rushing to catch a cab. Did they feel as lost as I did? Or was it just me, trapped in this endless cycle of failure and loneliness? For the first time in a long while, I spoke aloud, my voice barely more than a whisper. "Is anyone out there?" I asked, the words trembling with the weight of desperation. "Please just help me." The room swallowed my plea, offering no answer. I wasn't sure who or what I was talking to. God? The universe? Myself? It didn't matter. I wasn't expecting a response. I wiped my face with the sleeve of my sweater and stood up, my legs shaky but determined to move. The fridge was almost empty, save for a bottle of ketchup and a half-empty carton of milk that was probably expired. I needed to eat, even if it was just instant noodles. My stomach grumbled as I grabbed my wallet from the counter and checked inside. $7.34. That was all I had left. Pulling my coat around me, I stepped out into the rain. The cold drops stung my skin as I walked to the corner store, my shoes splashing through puddles. The night air was sharp, carrying the scent of wet asphalt and something faintly metallic. I pulled my hood tighter around my face and kept my head down, avoiding the gaze of passersby. The store was nearly empty, the fluorescent lights flickering slightly as I walked down the aisles. I grabbed a single packet of instant ramen and a small loaf of bread, calculating the total in my head. It would leave me with just a couple of dollars, but I didn't have much of a choice. At the counter, the cashier gave me a quick smile as she scanned my items. "Rainy night, huh?" she said, her tone light but distant. "Yeah," I replied softly, handing over the crumpled bills. As she handed me the change, I couldn't help but notice how her eyes lingered on my face for a moment longer than necessary. Did she see it? The exhaustion, the hopelessness, or was I just imagining it? I shoved the change into my pocket and stepped back into the rain. The weight of the groceries in my hand felt heavier than it should have. The streetlights cast long shadows on the wet pavement as I walked back toward my apartment. The city felt alive and indifferent all at once. A million lives unfolding around me, while mine seemed to be crumbling. Halfway home, I stopped. Something felt off. It wasn't a sound or a sight, but a feeling. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and a shiver ran down my spine. I looked around, but the street was empty. The rain had driven everyone indoors, leaving me alone under the flickering streetlights. Then I heard it. A voice, soft and almost imperceptible, drifted through the rain. "You're not alone." I froze. My breath caught in my throat as I turned in every direction, searching for the source. The street was still empty. The only sound was the steady patter of rain on the pavement. My heart pounded in my chest. Had I imagined it? Was my mind finally breaking under the pressure? Before I could process what had just happened, something caught my eye, a small, folded piece of paper tumbling along the sidewalk. It stopped at my feet, as if the wind had placed it there on purpose. Slowly, I bent down and picked it up, my fingers trembling. The paper was damp but intact, the ink inside surprisingly clear. There were only 3 words written in a neat, steady hand. "Hold on tight." I stared at the words, my mind racing. Who had written this? How had it ended up here, at this exact moment, when I was at my lowest? The rain blurred my vision as fresh tears welled up. This time, not from despair, but something else. Something I couldn't quite name. I clutched the note tightly in my hand and looked up at the sky, the rain mixing with the tears on my face. For the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't feel completely alone. Maybe, just maybe, there was something out there after all. The morning after I found that mysterious note, I woke up to a faint glimmer of hope. Just a faint one. Barely enough to notice, but it was there. I kept the paper on the nightstand next to me, folded neatly like it was something precious. My apartment was as cold and dim as always, but the weight in my chest felt slightly less crushing. Still, as I rubbed the sleep from my eyes and faced the reality of my situation, the tiny flicker of hope threatened to snuff itself out. The rent was still overdue, my fridge was still empty, and the job I clung to like a lifeline was barely enough to keep me afloat. The logical part of me told me the note was just a coincidence. Some stray piece of litter blown by the wind at the exact moment I happened to pass by. But another part of me, the part that had whispered to the emptiness the night before, wanted to believe it was something more. It wasn't like I had anything else to hold on to. I got dressed and headed out for another shift at the diner. The air outside was still damp from the rain, and the world looked gray and tired, as if it had absorbed my mood. I walked the 2 blocks to work with my head down, avoiding eye contact with strangers on the street. The folded note was tucked into the pocket of my jacket, and I found myself reaching for it more than once, my fingers brushing against the paper like it was some kind of talisman. When I reached the diner, the usual sounds of clattering dishes and murmured conversations greeted me. It was a small place, one of those old-fashioned diners with red vinyl booths and a jukebox in the corner that nobody used anymore. It smelled like coffee and grease, a combination I usually found comforting, but today it just reminded me of how trapped I felt. I tied my apron around my waist and forced a smile as I approached my first table of the day. A middle-aged couple sat there, both scrolling through their phones without speaking to each other. "Good morning," I said, my voice bright and practiced. "Can I get you started with some coffee?" They barely looked up as they nodded. I went through the motions, pouring coffee, taking orders, refilling drinks, but my mind was elsewhere. Every now and then, I caught myself glancing out the window, half expecting another sign, Another whisper from the invisible force that had reached out to me the night before. By mid-morning, the diner had started to fill up. The steady rhythm of work kept me busy, which was a small blessing. When I was focused on serving tables, I didn't have time to dwell on the mountain of problems waiting for me outside these walls. But then something strange happened. I was clearing a table near the window when I felt it again, that presence. It was subtle, almost like a shift in the air around me. My skin prickled, and I froze for a moment, my hand hovering over an empty coffee cup. "Are you all right?" a voice asked. I turned to see one of my regulars, an elderly man named Mr. Hawthorne, looking at me with concern. He always ordered the same thing, black coffee and a slice of apple pie, and he had a habit of sitting at the counter and chatting with whoever would listen. "Yeah," I said quickly, shaking off the feeling. "Just spaced out for a second." He smiled, but his eyes lingered on me a little longer than usual. "You've got a good head on your shoulders," he said, his voice warm and reassuring. "Don't let the hard times get you down." I nodded and forced another smile before retreating to the back of the diner to catch my breath. The feeling of being watched, of not being alone, stayed with me for the rest of my shift. It wasn't unpleasant. If anything, it was oddly comforting. But it was also unsettling, like I was teetering on the edge of something I didn't fully understand. When my shift finally ended, I walked home with the same slow, measured steps I always did. The folded note was still in my pocket, and I found myself pulling it out and unfolding it as I walked. "Hold on tight." The words seemed to glow faintly in the fading light of the afternoon, as if they were meant just for me. That's when I heard it again. The voice. "You're not alone." I stopped in my tracks, my heart pounding. This time, the voice was clearer than it had been the night before. It was soft but steady, like a gentle breeze brushing against my ears. I turned around, scanning the empty street for any sign of where it had come from. There was no one there. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaky. There was no answer, just the distant hum of a car engine and the rustling of leaves in the wind. I stood there for a long moment, clutching the note in my hand, before finally turning and continuing my walk home. My steps were quicker now, my mind racing with questions I didn't have answers to. When I reached my apartment, I locked the door behind me and leaned against it, trying to steady my breathing. I didn't know what was happening, whether I was losing my mind or if something truly unexplainable was at work, but I couldn't deny the feeling that something had shifted. The universe, it seemed, was speaking to me in whispers and nudges, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to listen. As I sat on the couch, staring at the note once again, a memory from my childhood floated to the surface. My grandmother used to tell me stories about angels, beings of light that watched over us, guiding us through life's darkest moments. I hadn't thought about those stories in years, but now they came rushing back, filling me with a strange mixture of comfort and unease. Could that be what this was? An angel? A guardian spirit? Or was it something else entirely? I didn't have any answers, but for the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of something I thought I'd lost forever. Hope. It wasn't much, just a tiny ember, but it was enough to keep me going. I tucked the note back into my pocket, closed my eyes, and whispered into the stillness, "Thank you." Whether or not anyone was listening, I wasn't sure. But as I drifted off to sleep that night, I felt a quiet sense of peace, as if the universe had answered my call in its own mysterious way. The next few days passed in a haze of cautious routine. The note stayed folded in my pocket wherever I went, like a secret I carried with me. Every so often, I'd pull it out and trace the words with my finger. "Hold on tight." They felt less like a command now and more like a promise, an anchor to keep me steady when my thoughts tried to drag me under. I didn't hear the voice again right away, but the feeling of being watched never completely left me. It was strange, though. Instead of unsettling me, The presence felt comforting, almost protective. I started to notice little things I hadn't paid attention to before. The way sunlight filtered through the curtains in the morning, the sound of birdsong outside my window, the faint smile from a stranger on the street. These small details felt like gifts, reminders that there was still beauty in the world if I chose to see it. Then one morning, everything shifted. I woke up to find an envelope slipped under my door. My heart jumped into my throat. My first thought was that it might be another eviction notice, though I wasn't sure why my landlord would choose such a strange way to deliver it. My second thought, less logical but far more insistent, was that it might be something else, something connected to the voice, the note, the invisible force that had been nudging me forward. My hands trembled as I picked it up and turned it over. There was no name, no address, no markings of any kind. It was just a plain white envelope sealed tightly. I tore it open, my breath catching as I pulled out the contents. Inside was a stack of cash, more money than I'd seen in months. My fingers fumbled as I counted it, my mind reeling. $500. $500 in crisp, neatly folded bills. And tucked between them was a small card with a single sentence written on it. Start fresh. I stared at the card, my heart pounding. Who could have done this? No one knew how much I was struggling. I hadn't told anyone. And even if they did, I couldn't think of a single person who would have gone to such lengths to help me. Tears welled up in my eyes as I clutched the card and the money to my chest. It wasn't just the relief of knowing I could finally pay off some of my overdue bills or buy groceries without worrying about every penny. It was the feeling that someone, somewhere, cared enough to step in when I needed it most. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to cry freely. The tears came in waves, each one washing away a layer of the despair that had been suffocating me. I didn't know who to thank, whether it was the voice, an unseen angel, or just an anonymous stranger, but I whispered a heartfelt thank you to the empty room. With the money, I was able to buy groceries, pay off my utility bills, and even set aside a small amount for emergencies. The relief was like a weight lifted off my shoulders. I could finally breathe again. But the most surprising thing wasn't the money, it was what followed. A few days later, I was standing in line at the grocery store, holding a basket filled with actual, real food. Fresh vegetables, bread, eggs. It wasn't much, but it felt like a feast compared to the scraps I'd been surviving on. When it was my turn at the register, I swiped my debit card, only for the screen to flash an error message. My stomach dropped. I knew I had enough money in my account. I checked just that morning. The cashier gave me an apologetic look. "It's not going through," she said. I opened my mouth to protest, to explain that there must be some kind of mistake, but before I could say anything, the woman standing behind me stepped forward. "Here," she said, handing the cashier her card. "I'll cover it." I turned to her, stunned. She was middle-aged, dressed in a simple cardigan and jeans, with kind eyes and a warm smile. "You don't have to do that," I stammered, feeling a mix of gratitude and embarrassment. She waved me off. "It's no trouble," she said. "Just pay it forward someday." I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. As she walked away, I wondered if she had any idea just how much her kindness meant to me. It wasn't just the groceries, it was the gesture itself, the reminder that there were still good people in the world. After that, it was like a domino effect. Little miracles kept happening, one after another. My landlord, who had always been strict and no-nonsense, suddenly gave me a 2-week extension on my rent without my even asking. "Just catching up on paperwork," he'd said, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it than that. I started getting callbacks for job applications I'd sent out weeks ago, applications I'd almost forgotten about. The interviews weren't easy, but each one felt like a step forward, a chance to rebuild what I'd thought was lost. One afternoon, while walking through the park to clear my head, I felt another nudge. This time, It wasn't a voice or a note, it was something simpler. A small boy was trying to reach for a soccer ball that had rolled under a bench, his tiny arms just shy of grabbing it. Without thinking, I crouched down and rolled the ball back to him. He looked up at me with wide, grateful eyes and said, "Thanks, mister." As I watched him run back to his family, something clicked. The miracles I'd been experiencing weren't just random acts of kindness. They were part of a larger chain. Each one seemed to ripple outward, touching others in ways I couldn't fully understand. Maybe that was the point. Maybe the invisible force wasn't just helping me. Maybe it was teaching me to see the world differently. By the time I got home that evening, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from having all the answers or knowing exactly what the future held. It was quieter than that, like the steady rhythm of a heartbeat. I pulled out the note from my pocket and unfolded it again. "Hold on tight." The words seemed different now, less like a warning and more like an invitation. I didn't know what lay ahead, but for the first time in weeks, I felt ready to face it. Whatever was guiding me, whether it was fate, faith, or something else entirely, I was finally starting to trust it. I don't know when it started to feel natural. The idea that I wasn't entirely alone in all of this. Maybe it was the note, or the money, or the woman in the grocery store, or the quiet presence that seemed to follow me, always just out of reach. Whatever it was, it felt less like a dream now and more like a part of my reality. There was something or someone helping me, nudging me forward when I felt like falling apart. One evening, after an especially exhausting day, I decided to take a walk. The park near my apartment had always been a place where I could think, even before everything in my life had spiraled out of control. There was something about the rustle of leaves, the quiet hum of crickets, and the distant laughter of kids playing that helped me breathe a little easier. As I walked along the gravel path, I felt that familiar sensation again, like someone was watching me. It wasn't ominous, though. It was warm, gentle, like a soft hand resting on my shoulder. I paused for a moment, closing my eyes and tilting my face toward the sky. The air was cool, tinged with the faint smell of rain, and I let myself soak in the stillness. Then, out of nowhere, the presence shifted. It was as if the invisible hand that had been guiding me suddenly pressed just a little harder, a subtle push in a specific direction. I opened my eyes and looked around, unsure of what I was supposed to see. The park was mostly empty, except for a man sitting on a bench not far from where I stood. He looked disheveled, his clothes worn and dirty, his shoulders hunched as he stared down at the ground. Something about him caught my attention, though I couldn't explain why. It was like I was being drawn toward him, a pull I couldn't ignore. I hesitated, unsure of what to do. I didn't have much to give, just a few dollars and a leftover sandwich I'd packed for dinner. But as I stood there, debating whether to approach him, I heard the voice again. Go to him. It was soft but firm, like a parent encouraging a child to take their first steps. My heart raced, but I obeyed. The invisible hand had never steered me wrong before, and for reasons I couldn't explain, I trusted it completely. "Hi," I said softly as I approached the bench. The man looked up, his eyes tired and wary. "I don't mean to bother you, but would you like something to eat?" His gaze flickered to the sandwich in my hand, and for a moment, I thought he might refuse. But then he nodded, his expression softening. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice hoarse. I handed him the sandwich and sat down on the opposite end of the bench. We didn't talk much, just a few polite exchanges. But there was a quiet understanding between us, a shared recognition of life's hardships. As I watched him eat, I felt something shift inside me. The miracles I'd experienced weren't just for me, I realized. They were meant to be shared. After a while, the man stood up, clutching the empty sandwich wrapper in his hands. "You didn't have to do that," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. "But, thank you." "Really?" I smiled, feeling an unexpected warmth spread through my chest. Take care, I said. And as he walked away, I felt the invisible presence again, almost as if it were pleased. When I got home that night, I couldn't stop thinking about the man on the bench. I wondered where he'd come from, what his story was, and whether he'd find the help he needed. But more than that, I thought about how little it had cost me to show him kindness, just a sandwich, a few minutes of my time, and how much it had seemed to mean to him. That night, as I lay in bed, I whispered a quiet prayer of thanks, not just for the miracles I'd received, but for the chance to be a part of someone else's. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of small but significant changes. The interviews I'd gone on began to bear fruit, and I landed a new job that paid better and offered more stability than the diner ever had. It wasn't glamorous, but it felt like a fresh start, a chance to rebuild my life. My landlord, perhaps softened by my recent efforts to catch up on rent, offered me a reduced rate for the next 3 months to help me get back on my feet. Even my relationships began to mend. My sister, whom I hadn't spoken to in over a year, called me out of the blue one evening. "I've been thinking about you," she said, her voice hesitant. "I'm sorry I've been so distant." We talked for hours, catching up on everything we'd missed in each other's lives. By the end of the call, I felt like a part of my old self had been restored, a piece of me I hadn't realized was missing. But through it all, the invisible presence remained, always there in the background. It wasn't as pronounced as it had been before. No voices, no notes, but I could feel it, guiding me in subtle ways. It was in the way I noticed opportunities one might have overlooked before, or the way strangers seemed to cross my path at just the right moment. One day, as I was walking home from work, I passed a group of kids playing in the street. Their laughter filled the air, a joyful reminder of life's simple pleasures. One of the boys accidentally kicked a soccer ball toward me, and it rolled to a stop at my feet. "Hey, mister," he called, waving. "Can you kick it back?" I picked up the ball, smiling as I tossed it back to him. "Nice shot," I said, and the boy grinned before running off to rejoin his friends. As I watched them play, I felt the presence again. This time, it wasn't a nudge or a whisper. It was a wave of warmth, like sunlight breaking through a storm. I stood there for a moment, letting the feeling wash over me, and I realized something I hadn't fully understood before. The invisible hand that had been guiding me wasn't just about solving my problems or pulling me out of the darkness. It was about connection, about reminding me that we're all part of something bigger than ourselves. The miracles I'd experienced weren't just random acts of kindness. They were part of a larger tapestry, a ripple effect of goodness that spread outward in ways I might never fully see. As I walked the rest of the way home, I thought about all the people who had touched my life over the past few weeks. The woman at the grocery store, the man on the bench, my sister. And I thought about how I could keep the chain going, how I could be the invisible hand for someone else. That night, I pulled out the note from my pocket and read it one more time. "Hold on tight." The words still resonated, but they felt different now, less like a command and more like an invitation. For the first time in a long time, I felt ready to accept it. It's strange how life can shift when you least expect it. A few weeks ago, I was convinced I was at rock bottom, staring down a pit I thought I'd never climb out of. Now, as I stood in the mirror getting ready for my first day of my new job, I barely recognized the person looking back at me. I adjusted my tie, crooked as usual, and ran my fingers through my hair, trying to tame the unruly strands. My reflection still looked a little tired, but there was something new in my eyes, something I hadn't seen in a long time. Hope. It wasn't overwhelming or flashy. It was quiet, steady, like the faint glow of a candle in a dark room. I took a deep breath and left my apartment, my bag slung over one shoulder. The air outside was crisp and cool, carrying the scent of freshly fallen leaves. The morning felt alive, vibrant, as if the world itself was reminding me of its beauty. For once, I didn't feel invisible, like a shadow passing through life unnoticed. I felt grounded, present, as if I belonged. The office wasn't far. A small marketing firm tucked away on the third floor of a nondescript building. The job wasn't glamorous, but it was stable, and that was all I needed. It offered a steady paycheck, health benefits, and most importantly, a chance to rebuild. Walking into the building, I felt a flicker of nervousness. Would they like me? Would I be good enough? The self-doubt crept in, but I shook it off. I couldn't afford to let it win. Hold on tight, I thought, the words etched into my mind like a mantra. The day went better than I expected. My co-workers were welcoming, and my supervisor, a kind woman named Janet, spent the morning showing me the ropes. By lunchtime, I felt like I could breathe again. The tasks were straightforward: drafting emails, managing schedules, but they gave me a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. As I sat in the break room, eating the sandwich I'd packed, a man around my age sat down across from me. He introduced himself as Eric, one of the graphic designers. "First day, huh?" he asked, his tone friendly. "Yeah," I said, smiling. Trying not to mess it up, he chuckled. "Don't worry. Janet's pretty patient. She's not going to throw you to the wolves." The conversation flowed easily after that. We talked about everything from our favorite movies to the best coffee spots in the area. For the first time in a long time, I felt a connection to someone, even if it was just a casual chat over lunch. It reminded me that the world wasn't as lonely as I'd convinced myself it was. By the time I left the office that evening, I felt lighter, almost like I was walking on air. It wasn't just about the job or the people. It was the feeling that my life was finally moving forward. The invisible hand that had been guiding me all this time seemed to have set me on a new path, one filled with possibilities. But the real miracle happened on my way home. As I turned onto the street leading to my apartment, I noticed a small commotion near the corner. A car had broken down, and a young woman stood by the side of the road, looking frustrated and helpless. Her hood was open, and she was staring at the engine like it was written in a foreign language. Something inside me told me to stop. I wasn't exactly a car expert, but I knew enough to check the basics. "Need a hand?" I asked, approaching her cautiously. She looked up, relief washing over her face. "Oh my gosh, yes. I have no idea what I'm doing." We spent the next 20 minutes fiddling with the engine, eventually determining it was a dead battery. I flagged down a passing driver for jumper cables and got her car started again. As the engine roared to life, she turned to me, her eyes shining with gratitude. "Thank you so much," she said, pressing a hand to her chest. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't stopped." "It's no problem," I said, brushing off her thanks. "Just glad I could help." She insisted on giving me her card, which I pocketed without much thought. It wasn't until later that night, as I emptied my pockets, that I noticed the name on the card. She was a hiring manager for a local nonprofit. My heart skipped a beat. Could this be another nudge? Another sign from the invisible force that had been steering my life? I didn't know what to do with the card at first, but something told me to hold on to it. Maybe I wouldn't need it now, but it felt important, like another piece of the puzzle falling into place. That night, as I lay in bed, I reflected on everything that had happened since I first found that note. The invisible hand had been there all along, working in ways I couldn't always see or understand. It wasn't just about the big miracles, the money, the job. It was the small, quiet moments too. The stranger who paid for my groceries. The man on the bench who reminded me of the power of kindness. The coworker who turned a lonely lunch break into a moment of connection. And now, this woman and her broken-down car. Another thread in the tapestry. Another ripple in the chain of goodness that seemed to flow through the world when I was open to it. I thought back to the man who had told me to pay it forward. At the time, I nodded without really understanding what he meant. But now, I realized that was what this was all about. The miracles weren't meant to stop with me. They were meant to move through me, touching others in ways I might never fully understand. Before I drifted off to sleep, I whispered another quiet thank you into the darkness. I didn't know if the invisible hand could hear me, or if it even needed to, but I knew, deep down, that I wasn't alone. I was part of something bigger than myself, something that had been with me all along. And for the first time in years, I felt ready, ready to keep moving forward, ready to hold on tight to whatever came next. The days turned into weeks, and life, for the first time in what felt like forever, began to feel stable. My new job was going well. I found myself looking forward to waking up in the mornings, knowing I had somewhere to go, something meaningful to do. My coworkers started to feel like friends, and little by little, I allowed myself to hope for a future I'd once thought was out of reach. Even though the invisible presence wasn't as noticeable as before, I still felt it, quietly working in the background. It was in the small things, the way opportunities seemed to align just when I needed them, or how kindness seemed to find me wherever I went. One evening, after a particularly good day at work, I decided to take a different route home. It wasn't a conscious decision, it just felt right. The streets were bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of blooming flowers. As I walked, I felt that familiar nudge, the faint but unmistakable push of the invisible hand guiding me. That's when I saw her. A little girl, no older than 7 or 8, was sitting on the curb, clutching a tattered teddy bear to her chest. Her cheeks were streaked with tears, and her eyes darted nervously around, searching for something or someone. My heart clenched at the sight. She looked so small, so scared. I approached her slowly, not wanting to startle her. "Hey there," I said softly, crouching down to her level. "Are you okay?" She shook her head, her bottom lip trembling. I lost my mom," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "She was here, and then she wasn't." I nodded, trying to keep my own emotions in check. "Okay, let's figure this out together. What's your name?" "Lila," she said, clutching the teddy bear even tighter. "Hi, Lila. I stopped myself, realizing my name didn't matter. What mattered was helping her. "We're gonna find your mom, okay? You're not alone." Her big, tear-filled eyes met mine, and for a moment, I saw something in them, a flicker of trust, of hope. I stood up and scanned the area, looking for anyone who might be frantically searching for a lost child. The street was quiet, save for a few passers-by who didn't seem to notice what was happening. "Do you remember where you last saw her?" I asked gently. Lila nodded and pointed toward a small park at the end of the street. "Over there," she said. "Okay, let's go check it out," I said, holding out my hand. She hesitated for a moment before slipping her small hand into mine. It was warm and fragile, and the weight of her trust hit me like a wave. As we walked to the park, I silently prayed for help. I didn't know if the invisible hand could hear me, or if it even needed to, but I asked for guidance anyway. "Please let us find her mom. Let her be safe." When we reached the park, it was bustling with families and children playing. I scanned the crowd, searching for a woman who looked panicked or out of place. Then I saw her, a woman pacing near the swings, her hands pressed to her face, her body tense with worry. "Lila," I said, pointing toward the woman. "Is that her?" Lila's eyes lit up, and she nodded furiously. "Mommy," she cried, letting go of my hand and running toward the woman. The moment her mother saw her, she dropped to her knees, her arms outstretched. "Lila," she sobbed, pulling the little girl into a tight embrace. "Oh my God, I was so scared." I stood back, watching as they clung to each other, tears streaming down both their faces. It was a moment so raw, so pure, that I felt my own eyes begin to sting. I didn't want to interrupt, but after a moment, the woman looked up at me, her expression a mixture of relief and gratitude. "Thank you," she said, her voice shaking. "Thank you so much for bringing her back to me." I shrugged, trying to downplay my role. "She found me, really? I'm just glad she's safe." The woman stood, still holding Lila tightly. "You don't understand," she said. "I thought I'd lost her forever. You've given me back my whole world." Her words hit me like a punch to the chest. I thought about the miracles that had carried me through my darkest days. The note, the money, the countless moments of kindness that had kept me moving forward. And now here I was, paying it forward in the most literal way possible. Before I left, Lila turned to me and said, "Thank you for helping me." She held out her teddy bear, as if she wanted me to take it. I crouched down again and smiled. "You keep him," I said. "He's your buddy, right? But whenever you hug him, you can remember this day and how brave you were." She nodded solemnly, her small face serious, and hugged the bear tightly. As I walked away, I felt that warmth again, the familiar presence of the invisible hand. But this time, it didn't feel like it was guiding me. It felt like it was thanking me. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about everything that had brought me to this moment. The chain of miracles that had started with a whispered plea in the darkness and led me to a place where I could give back. I realized that the invisible hand wasn't just some external force working on my behalf. It was something I was now a part of, something I could contribute to. The tears came slowly at first, then in waves, spilling over as I thought about Lila and her mother, about the people who had helped me when I was at my lowest, and about the quiet, steady force that had carried me through it all. They weren't tears of sadness or even relief. They were tears of gratitude, pure and overwhelming. For the first time in years, I felt truly whole. Not because my life was perfect. It wasn't, but because I understood now that I wasn't alone, and I never had been. The miracles weren't just about me. They were about connection, about the way we all touch each other's lives in ways we might never fully understand. Before I fell asleep, I whispered into the quiet, just as I had on that first desperate night. "Thank you." This time, I knew someone was listening.